The late 18th and early 19th century was a time of periodic warfare between England and France. Battles were won and lost on land and at sea, and heroes rose to glory. But one man rose above all others and became a national treasure. This is the history of Horatio Nelson. Horatio Nelson was born on the 29th of September 1758 at a rectory in Burnham Thorpe, Norfolk, England, the sixth of 11 children of the Reverend Edmund Nelson and his wife, Catherine Suckling. Nelson's interest in the Navy began at a young age, as his uncle, Maurice Suckling, was a high-ranking naval officer and is believed to have had a major impact on Nelson's life. Nelson's particularly strong hatred for the French also most likely came from Maurice, who described them as gobblers in a conversation with him as a child. Nelson attended Paston Grammar School, North Walsham, until he was 12 years old, and also attended King Edward VI Grammar School in Norwich. His naval career began on the 1st of January 1771, when he was appointed to the newly commissioned third-rate ship HMS Reasonable as an ordinary seaman and coxswain under his uncle Captain Maurice Suckling, who commanded the vessel. Shortly after reporting aboard, Nelson was appointed a midshipman and began officer training. Early in his service, Nelson suffered from seasickness, something that he experienced for the rest of his life. HMS Reasonable had been commissioned during a period of tension with Spain, but when this passed, Nelson was dispatched to serve aboard the West Indiaman Mary Ann of the merchant shipping firm of Hibbert, Peoria and Horton to gain experience at sea. Nelson rose rapidly through the ranks and served with leading naval commanders of the period before obtaining his own command at the age of 20 in 1778. He developed a reputation of personal valour and a firm grasp of tactics, but suffered periods of illness and unemployment at the end of the American War of Independence. In 1784, Nelson received command of the frigate HMS Boreas, with the assignment to enforce the Navigations Acts in the vicinity of Antigua. The acts were unpopular with both the Americans and the colonies. Nelson served on the station under Admiral Sir Richard Hughes, and often came into conflict with his superior officer over their differing interpretations of the acts. The captains of the American vessels Nelson had seized sued him for illegal seizure. Because the merchants of the nearby island of Nevis supported the American claim, Nelson was in peril of imprisonment. He remained requisitioned on Boreas for 8 months until the courts ruled in his favour. It was during his time on Boreas that Nelson met Frances Nisbet, a young widow from a Nevis plantation family. Nelson developed an affection for her, and in response her uncle John Herbert offered him a massive dowry. Both Herbert and Nisbet concealed the fact that their famed riches were a fiction, and Fanny did not disclose the fact that she was infertile due to a womb infection. Once they were engaged, Herbert offered Nelson nowhere near the dowry he had promised. During the Georgian era, breaking a marital engagement was seen as quite dishonourable, and so Nelson and Nisbet were married at Montpelier Estate on the island of Nevis on the 11th of March 1787, shortly before the end of his tour of duty in the Caribbean. The outbreak of the French Revolutionary Wars allowed Nelson to return to service, where he was particularly active in the Mediterranean. He fought in several minor engagements off Toulon and was important in the capture of Corsica, where he was wounded and partially lost sight in one eye, and subsequent diplomatic duties with the Italian states. In 1797 he distinguished himself while in command of HMS Captain at the Battle of Cape St. Vincent. Shortly after the battle, Nelson took part in the Battle of Santa Cruz de Tenerife, where the attack failed and he lost his right arm, forcing him to return to England to recuperate. But Nelson would not rest long. Nelson was said to have fought heroically at the Battle of Cape St. Vincent on the 14th of February 1797, and his disobeying of orders was key to victory. On the 20th of February 1798, in a standard promotion according to his seniority and unrelated to the battle, Nelson was promoted to Rear Admiral of the Blue. French activities in the Mediterranean theatre were raising concern amongst the Admiralty, as Napoleon was gathering forces in southern France, but the destination of his army was unknown. Nelson and the vanguard were to be dispatched to Cadiz to reinforce the fleet. On the 28th of March 1798, Nelson hoisted his flag and sailed to join Earl St. Vincent. St. Vincent sent him on to Toulon with a small force to reconnoitre French activities. Nelson began hunting the French fleet across the Mediterranean, but was having no luck. He captured a French merchant ship, which provided the first news of the French fleet heading to Alexandria. Nelson hurried to the port, but again found it empty of the French. Searching along the coast, he finally discovered the French fleet at Akbar Bay on the 1st of August 1798. What followed was one of Nelson's finest victories. The British fleet was soon heavily engaged, passing down the French line and engaging their ships one by one. Nelson, on vanguard, personally engaged Spartiate. At about 8 o'clock, he was with Edward Berry on the quarterdeck when a piece of French shot struck him in the forehead. He fell to the deck with a flap of torn skin obscuring his good eye. Blinded and half stunned, he felt sure that he would die and cried out, "I am killed, remember me to my wife." He was taken below and seen by the surgeon. After examining Nelson, the surgeon pronounced that the wound was non-threatening and applied a temporary bandage. The Battle of the Nile was a major blow to Napoleon's ambition in the east. The French fleet had been destroyed. Orient, another ship, and 2 frigates had been burnt, while 7 74 gunships and 2 80 gunships had been captured. Only 2 ships of the line and 2 frigates escaped. Nelson wrote dispatches to the Admiralty and oversaw temporary repairs before sailing to Naples, where he was met with enthusiastic celebrations. King Ferdinand IV of Naples, in company with the Hamiltons, greeted him in person when he arrived at port, and Sir William Hamilton invited Nelson to stay at his home. Celebrations were held in honour of Nelson's birthday that September, and he attended a banquet at the Hamiltons' house, where other officers began to notice his attentions to Emma, Lady Hamilton. This scandalous affair could have ended Nelson's career, but in early October, word of Nelson's victory had reached London and overshadowed the matter. The First Lord of the Admiralty, George Spencer, fainted upon hearing the news. Scenes of celebration erupted across the country, balls and victory feasts were held, and church bells were rung. The City of London awarded Nelson and his captains swords, whilst the King ordered that they be presented with special medals. Nelson received the title of Baron Nelson of the Nile. In 1801, Nelson was dispatched to the Baltic Sea and defeated neutral Denmark at the Battle of Copenhagen. He commanded the blockade of the French and Spanish fleets at Toulon, and after their escape chased them to the West Indies and back, but failed to bring them to battle. After a brief return to England, he took over the Cadiz blockade in 1805. On the 21st of October 1805, the Franco-Spanish fleet came out of port, and Nelson's fleet engaged them at the Battle of Trafalgar. Nelson was outnumbered, with 27 British ships of the line to 33 Allied ships, including the largest warship in either fleet. To address this imbalance, Nelson sailed his fleet directly at the Allied battle line's flank, hoping to break it into pieces. The tactic exposed the leading ships in the British line to intense fire from multiple ships as they approached the Franco-Spanish lines. Nelson's own HMS Victory led the front column and was almost knocked out of action. At 1:15 in the afternoon, Hardy realised that Nelson was not by his side. He turned to see Nelson kneeling on the deck, supporting himself with his hand before falling onto his side. Hardy rushed to him, at which point Nelson smiled and said, "Hardy, I do believe they have done it at last. My backbone is shot through." He had been hit by a musket ball at a range of 50 feet. The ball entered his left shoulder, passed through a lung, then his spine. Nelson was carried below to the cockpit by Sergeant Major of the Marines, Robert Adair, and 2 seamen. As he was being carried down, he asked them to pause a while and gave advice to a midshipman on the handling of the tiller. He then draped a handkerchief over his face to avoid causing alarm amongst the crew. Hardy came below decks to see Nelson just after 2:30 and informed him that a number of enemy ships had surrendered. Nelson told him that he was sure to die and begged him to pass his possessions on to Emma. Those with Nelson at this point were the chaplain Alexander Scott, the purser Walter Burke, Nelson's steward, Chevalier, and Beatty. Nelson, fearing that a gale was blowing up, instructed Hardy to be sure to anchor. After reminding him to take care of poor Lady Hamilton, Nelson said, "Kiss me, Hardy." Beatty recorded that Hardy knelt and kissed Nelson on the cheek, then he stood for a minute or two before kissing Nelson on the forehead. Nelson asked, "Who is that?" On hearing that it was Hardy, he replied, "God bless you, Hardy." Nelson died at 4:30 in the afternoon, 3 hours after he had been shot. He was 47 years old. His body was then placed in a cask of brandy and returned to Britain, where he received a state funeral. Nelson's death at Trafalgar secured his position as one of Britain's most heroic figures. His signal just prior to the commencement of battle, "England expects that every man will do his duty," is regularly quoted and paraphrased. Numerous monuments, including Nelson's column in Trafalgar Square, London, and Nelson's monument in Edinburgh, have been created in his memory.